Hello, everyone. So, we are Abohar History Project. Abohar is a small town in Punjab at Rajasthan and Pakistan border. It has been our home for past 1 month while we prepared for our first exhibition that is now live at Nehru Park in Abohar. We are a bunch of historians and designers who are now working towards our next exhibition, a neighborhood museum at Arya Mahila Paropkarini Sabha. So, this project aims to curate 6 neighborhood museums in the selected parts of the city through an engagement with community history, orality, and memory. A series of talks, podcasts, interviewing, cultural mapping, digitization, archiving, and conversations on a city museum are organized over the course of the next 6 months from January to June 2022. My name is Prachi, and on the behalf of Abohar History Project, I would be coordinating our third lecture in Small Town Histories by Venugopal Maddipati. Venugopal Maddipati is an architectural historian teaching in the School of Design at Ambedkar University, Delhi. His themes of interest lie in housing, ecological aesthetics, and law. His publications include books titled Water Histories of South Asia, The Materiality of Liquescence, co-edited with Dr. Sugata Ray, and Gandhi and Architecture, a time for low-cost housing. He's currently working on a book on mimesis. The title of today's lecture is A People's Architectural Autonomy, Frederick Salmond Grouse in Bulandshahr. So, let's start.
Hi, everybody. Good to have this opportunity to speak. And I've followed the work Yogesh and all of you are doing at Abohar for quite some time. And I think one of the ways in which we actually, titling the entire process is this reference to something like a small town. And also at one level, what is something of a legacy from the 19th century is this idea of the anonymity of the small town. यानी कि जो छोटा शहर है उसकी कोई पहचान नहीं होती और वो क्यों नहीं होती उसके बारे में कुछ ऐसे सवाल हम आज कोशिश करेंगे उठाने की जो एक खासकर एक बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट जो एक डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर थे बुलंदशहर जो एक शहर है जो एक दिल्ली से खास ज़्यादा दूर नहीं है वहाँ के जो डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर थे जिनका नाम था फ्रेडरिक सैलमन ग्राउस तो उनके नज़रिए से हम थोड़ा सा इस सवाल के कुछ जवाब ढूंढेंगे तो हालांकि जब ये मैंने पहले सोचा था जब इस टॉक के बारे में तो मुझे पता नहीं था कि इसे हिंदी में देना है तो मेरी हिंदी इतनी कोई खास अच्छी नहीं है तो फिर मैंने क्या किया कि मैंने मेरे पास जो इंग्लिश स्लाइड्स थे उसमें मैंने गूगल ट्रांसलेट के कुछ ऐसे ट्रांसलेशंस लगा दिए और वो ट्रांसलेशंस देख के मैं खुद घबरा गया कि ये वर्ड्स तो बहुत ही बड़े हैं वजनी वर्ड्स हैं हिंदी में भी तो अगर आप उन वर्ड्स को देखें तो आप मतलब चौंकिएगा मत मैं कोशिश करूंगा कि उनको थोड़ा सा इंग्लिश में सिंप्लीफाई करके बोलूं तो आई थिंक आई स्टार्ट जो प्रेजेंटेशन है इसके मैं जरा अपना स्क्रीन शेयर करता हूँ so one second तो कुछ इमेजेस हैं मैं इनको थोड़ा सा मैंने जो टाइटल दिया था टॉक का वो था ऑटोनॉमी से कुछ रिलेशनशिप था उसका लेकिन आई थिंक वो ऑटोनॉमी की बात हम आई थिंक वील अंडरस्टैंड ग्रेजुअली लेकिन एक चीज़ जो है इस टॉक में मैं खास एक चीज़ को मैं इम्पोर्टेंस देना चाहता हूँ वो इसका एक टाइटल इस तरह से भी देख सकते हैं इसको हम कह सकते हैं कि इट्स अ टॉक ऑन एन एम्फसिस ऑन एम्फसिस एम्फसिस को एक तरह से महत्व को महत्व देना आई गेस दैट इज द क्रूड ट्रांसलेशन दैट आई कैन एक्चुअली गिव टू दिस टॉक और महत्व तो आप आई होप यू आर एबल टू ड्रॉ द कनेक्शन कि एक छोटे शहर को महत्व कैसे देना उसको एक इम्पोर्टेंस किस तरह से दिया जा सकता है वो एक पार्ट है इस प्रेजेंटेशन का लेकिन जो ग्राउस की पॉलिटिक्स है वो खासकर इस वर्ड से कुछ जुड़ी हुई है इम्पोर्टेंस और एम्फसिस देना और ये खासकर उनका जो कार्यकाल है बुलंदशहर में वो उस दौर का 19वीं शताब्दी के लेटर पोर्शंस में उनका वहाँ पे कार्यकाल है और वहाँ पे उस दौर में जो एक उनका पेट्रनेज रहा आर्किटेक्चर के फील्ड में वो काफी there's a lot of stuff that he did तो ये एक तरह से उनके टाइम में जो एक गेट बनाई गई थी बुलंदशहर में, ये उसका एक इमेज है जो उनके मेमोइर्स में से मैंने निकाल के यहाँ पे प्लेस किया है। तो मेरी उम्मीद है कि बाय द एंड ऑफ दिस टॉक आई एम एबल टू शो यू कि इस गेट से भी वो वही मैसेज दोहराने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि महत्व को कैसे महत्व दिया जाए, यानी कि एम्फोसिस को कैसे एम्फोसाइज किया जाए। क्योंकि जिस कंडीशन में जिस शहर में जिस शहर को कोई एम्फोसिस नहीं देता, या जिस जगह के बारे में किसी को उसका महत्व नहीं मालूम, उस महत्व को कैसे फिर हम एक तरह से उभार के लाएं, राइट। तो कुछ ऐसा ही है आज का एक तरह से हमारा टॉक। और ये एक तरह से उनकी एक तस्वीर है, ये फ्रेडरिक सैलमन ग्राउस 1836 टू 1893। उन्होंने बुलंदशहर में 1876 से लेके 1883 तक के दौर में उनका कार्यकाल रहा वहां पे। इससे पहले ग्राउस सर्व्ड इन मथुरा, तो वो भी एक तरह से स्मॉल टाउन की तरह ही यू कैन से। और उनके जो मथुरा मेमोइर्स हैं वो काफी फेमस हैं। इन्होंने काफी ट्रांसलेशंस भी किए हैं, और जैसे तुलसीदास के रामचरितमानस का भी इन्होंने ट्रांसलेशन किया है। और मथुरा में जो खासकर जो कुषाण पीरियड के जो अवशेष हैं, उनकी जो प्रदर्शनी है, उनका जो म्यूजियम है मथुरा में, वो खासकर ग्राउस की देन है। तो ही वाज अ वेरी फेमस एंटिक्वेरियन, और वो एक तरह से लोकल लैंग्वेजेस में भी काफी माहिर थे। और जनरली ही सीन एज अ वेरी एरुडाइट पर्सन। उनकी एक तरह से कुछ पॉलिटिक्स भी है, जिसके बारे में अगर बाद में कभी बात करने को मिले तो वी कैन टॉक। तो दिस टॉक इज अबाउट हिम, लेकिन उन तक पहुंचने से पहले आई थिंक हमें थोड़ी बहुत भूमिका, फाउंडेशन और थोड़ा सा अंडरस्टैंडिंग हमें लेना होगा। तो मैं उन चीजों के बारे में बात करूंगा अभी। तो जैसे कि मैंने कहा कि महत्व को महत्व देना, और ये एक तरह से उनका काफी स्ट्रॉन्ग कंट्रीब्यूशन रहा। और वो ही इज अ क्रिटिक ऑफ डी एम्फसाइजिंग, यानी कि महत्व को दबाने की जो एक तरह से एक टेंडेंसी है, जो एक खास संगठन है, ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है कॉल्ड द पब्लिक वर्क्स डिपार्टमेंट, वो उसके बड़े आलोचक थे। ही इज अ बिग क्रिटिक ऑफ दिस अटेम्प्ट एट डी एम्फसाइजिंग नॉट जस्ट स्मॉल टाउन्स बट डी एम्फसाइजिंग एज सच। और ये डी एम्फसाइजिंग जो चीज है, इसको हमें पहले समझना होगा कि ये कैसे उभर के आया पब्लिक वर्क्स डिपार्टमेंट की सोच में। तो और उसको भी समझने के लिए एक और बहुत ही थोड़ा सा मोटा सा वर्ड है, ऑटोनोमाइजेशन, यानी ऑटोनॉमी से जुड़ा हुआ। अब ऑटोनॉमी के मैंने गूगल ट्रांसलेट में तो मीनिंग्स बहुत ही अलग अलग निकल के आए, स्वावलंबन and Swaraj, and so there are many different ways of translating it, लेकिन hopefully उस वर्ड का जो मीनिंग है वो हम पब्लिक वर्क्स डिपार्टमेंट की परिभाषा में कैसे निकल के आती है, we'll try and understand that. तो स्वयं शासन, that's a very simple translation. So PWD ये एक ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है जो 1850 के दशक में it actually comes into existence. और जैसा कि आप जानते हैं 1857 is also a very important date in South Asian history. जो इंसरेक्शन हुआ, रेबेलियन हुआ, वो उस दौर का है। तो PWD का भी एक तरह से आगमन उसी दौर से जुड़ा हुआ है, लेकिन उससे पहले से वो शुरू हुई थी। लेकिन the rebellion has a huge impact also in the functioning of the PWD. तो अब ऑटोनोमाइजेशन की जब बात करते हैं तो PWD एक ऐसा ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो खुद ही एक तरह से अपना स्वयं शासन कायम करने की कोशिश कर रहा है। One second, there's किसी ने कुछ any question anybody has? Dear professor, one second. If I don't understand Hindi, okay, Vishwadharini, Yogesh, what would you say? Somebody is requesting that if you could...
I don't know. I frankly don't know. You be comfortable in whatever language you are.
I'll try and speak in both. I'll try and mix and match both things. Okay, so I'll do the best that I can. Bear with me. Okay, so I'll just come back to my presentation. So the PWD comes up in the 1850s as an organization that is already trying to be an autonomous organization. यानी कि PWD जब उसका आगमन होता है 1850s में, तो वो खुद ही एक तरह से अपना ही राज कायम करने की कोशिश कर रहा है, राइट? और वो किस चीज से अपने आप को ऑटोनोमाइज करने की कोशिश कर रहा है? इट्स ट्राइंग टू ऑटोनोमाइज इटसेल्फ फ्रॉम हायरार्कीज। यानी कि हिंदी में इसका एक डायरेक्ट ट्रांसलेशन करेंगे तो पदानुक्रम से मुक्ति, यानी कि it is trying to actually make itself free of hierarchies, right? And that's a very significant thing, and I'll try and explain वो किस तरह से वो करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. So let me just come back to my presentation screen. So what you see is that, like, when you're thinking about architecture, there is a way in which buildings themselves also follow hierarchies, right? This is the basic जो architecture जो इमारत बनाते हैं तो उसमें ये पदानुक्रम जो है वो हमेशा ही रहता है. Hierarchy building बनाने का ही मतलब hierarchy है, right? A building is hierarchical by definition in many instances, right? So what we imagine is that, like, a building has spaces which are, some spaces are more important than others, right? So those more important spaces gain more emphasis in comparison to certain other spaces which are not as important. Just the way in which kuch aise shahar hai, some towns are there that are more important than others, and therefore they gain more attention, they get more money from central organizations than certain other towns, right? So hierarchy is the norm, right? But hierarchy in architecture is a very common thing to witness, right? And it's not a very, very difficult concept to understand, and I'll try and explain that, right? How is that? Like, just to say that, so public works department, before it comes into India, right, what you do see is a very strong emphasis on hierarchy in building. यानी कि पब्लिक वर्क्स डिपार्टमेंट के आगमन से पहले इमारतों को पदानुक्रम में बनाया जाता था, और so basically then you build a building hierarchically and then you put functions inside it. यानी कि पहले पदानुक्रम के हिसाब से बिल्डिंग को बनाया जाता है, फिर उसके अंदर कार्यों को फिट किया जाता है, राइट? मगर पीडब्ल्यूडी के आने के बाद this kind of hierarchy is a direct attack on this idea of hierarchy, right? So the PWD is trying to establish its own autonomy from the existing hierarchies that are there. जो पहले से ही hierarchies हैं, वो उससे अपने आप को निजात कर रहा है, right? So let's just take, and I'm going to give you some examples, not from India. I'm going to talk about a time from before the emergence of the PWD. मैं इंग्लैंड में जाना चाहता हूँ क्योंकि पीडब्ल्यूडी का पॉलिटिक्स सीधा इंग्लैंड से रिलेटेड है, राइट? और तो हमें समझना होगा कि वो कहाँ से आ रहे हैं, राइट? बिकॉज दीज आर ऑल ब्रिटिश ऑफिशियल्स वर कमिंग इनटू इंडिया, एंड इन द 1850s वो लोग आके इस संगठन में दे आर एक्चुअली ट्राइंग टू लिटरली क्रिएट इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर, राइट? तो लेकिन दे आर ऑल्सो सॉर्ट ऑफ इन सम वेज a part of a culture that is moving towards what you call English utilitarianism, right? अब उसका हिंदी translation तो मेरे पास है नहीं, but it is a kind of a utilitarian aesthetic that is emerging in the PWD, where hierarchy is not the most important thing, rather functional allocation is more important, and this is at a remove from the older form of architecture that you see in England, right? अब उसके example के तौर पे the most excessive version of that I can give you is this particular example called the Brighton Pavilion. अब एक second, 1 second, sorry, the screen vanished. तो ये Brighton Pavilion जो है ये 1823 में this was actually completed, and this belongs to what you call the Regency Period, which is seen as a period of excesses, जिसमें जो King George थे, he's supposed to be like this very 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 profuse individual जो बहुत ही उनकी शानदार जिंदगी थी, and he would spend a lot, right? और वो उनको जब याद किया जाता है, whenever he is remembered, he is seen as a person representing excess in British history, right? कि वो खाते भी ज्यादा थे, वो मोटे भी बहुत थे, और उनकी जो उनकी आदतें थी वो सारी बहुत ही ऑप्युलेंस के साथ जुड़ी हुई थी, यानी कि वो बहुत ही एक तरह से he was a very opulent person, and his the architecture also जो उनके दौर से जोड़ी जाती है उसमें भी एक तरह से इस तरह का एक्सेस, यानी कि एक बहुत ही ज्यादा पैसों से बना हुआ और एक तरह से एक्सेसिव डिजाइन में एक तरह से बहुत ही एक्सट्रावेगेंट डिजाइन बनाने की कोशिश की जाती थी. तो इसका सीधा एग्जांपल है ब्राइटन पवेलियन, जो रीजेंसी पीरियड से जुड़ी हुई है. 1795 to 1837 is what you usually identify as the Regency period. तो अब इसमें देखिए, if you actually see a photograph of this building, which is the Brighton Pavilion, you can very easily see how hierarchy is actually shown over here. I'm not talking about something very profound, huh? So don't look for something very profound. If you look for something simple, you'll find it very easily. The simple point is that there is always a center, right? Building में, पूरे building complex में कोई एक ऐसी जगह होती है, केंद्र बिंदु होती है. There is a center. There is a point where power kind of coagulates, or power kind of is concentrated, right? और ये तो आपको कहीं पे भी मिल जाएगा. इंडिया में there are so many examples. You will find that power usually resides in a center. Power usually is the place of power is usually taller than the rest of the areas around it, right? It has more emphasis, right? उस पे जो मैंने कहा कि वो जोर यानी कि महत्व, right? Power जहाँ पे होती है वहाँ पे हमेशा size में, it's at a very simple level, size का इजाफा होता है. There is a bigger size that you associate with the location of power, right? And this is a standard pattern of building that you see in the architecture that precedes the PWD. It's not always the case, as you'll see towards the end of the presentation, but zyadatar, more often than not, power is oftentimes represented in the way in which a building is organized, right? That is pretty much the nature of most of the buildings we know from a time from before, even in India. Now, this is a plan of the building. तो अगर आप plan में देखें उसी building का, तो यही elevation जो अभी आपने देखी, ये जो image देखी, इसको आप plan में देख रहे हैं, तो ये जो यहाँ पे है, this is the point where जो गुंबद देख रहे थे, this is the dome that you're seeing. And usually in this form of architecture, what you'll see is that there's always a central line, यानी कि एक symmetrical form होता है, यानी कि बीच में एक ऐसा line होता है जहाँ पे महत्व होता है. And on either side of that, you have usually some kind of a mirroring of form, right? थोड़ा बहुत फर्क होगा, लेकिन ज्यादातर you will see even in this image there is emphasis on symmetry. यहाँ दो गुंबद हैं, यहाँ दो गुंबद हैं, यहाँ पे एक तरह से एक किस्म का कियोस्क है, यहाँ पे भी उसी तरह का है, right? So this is the way in which power is actually represented in architecture. Composition में symmetry का ज्यादा, there is an emphasis on symmetry, there is an emphasis on there being some kind of a central line where power is concentrated, or a central point which is usually emphasized by height, right? तो ये एक बहुत ही कॉमन अंडरस्टैंडिंग है. ये आपको इंडिया में भी बहुत एग्जांपल्स मिल जाएंगे. नॉट समथिंग टेरिबली स्ट्रेंज, राइट? बट दिस इज द वर्ल्ड ऑफ हायरार्की एंड पावर दैट वी आर लुकिंग एट. तो इस किस्म की जो प्लानिंग है जिसमें राजे रजवाड़ों का ज्यादा प्रेजेंस रहता है, इस किस्म की प्लानिंग में, दिस इज द काइंड ऑफ प्लानिंग दैट इज मोर tied in with structures of power and feudal or even hierarchical modes of functioning, where there's a king, right, monarchy. This is usually what we associate with a world that precedes the emergence of PWD. It's not exclusively this, यानी कि ऐसा नहीं है कि ये हर जगह ऐसा ही था. कुछ exceptions हमेशा होते हैं, but sometimes when we actually trying to talk about the emergence of utilitarianism, यानी कि जो British utilitarian architecture जो हिंदुस्तान में आती है, उसमें इस तरह की जो हायरार्किकल थिंकिंग है उससे अलग एक फाइनेंशियलाइजेशन हो जाता है आर्किटेक्चर का. उसको हम बाद में समझेंगे, लेकिन जस्ट टू से दिस इज व्हाट वी आर गेनिंग ऑटोनॉमी फ्रॉम. हम इससे आजादी पा रहे हैं व्हेन वी आर एक्चुअली टॉकिंग अबाउट द पीडब्ल्यूडी, क्योंकि पीडब्ल्यूडी का पूरा एक बहुत ही मैकेनिकल फिलॉसफी है. उनको ये नहीं पड़ी है, दे आर नॉट इंटरेस्टेड इन हाउ टू शो पावर. They are interested in A, getting the job done, B, at the cheapest price possible, C, in the fastest possible way, D, in as efficient a way as possible, right? So the PWD is known for these few things, like it's known for efficiency, standardization of plans, right? And trying kind of going for this kind of de-hierarchical mode of building. तो ये खास बात है, और इसमें कुछ थोड़े से हम एग्जाम्पल्स भी देखते हैं. तो ऐसा मैं जैसे कह रहा था कि जो the emergence of the PWD in the 1850s and its increasing emphasis on establishing the plan itself was a neutral system of order. न्यूट्रल यानी कि जो पहले की जैसे मैंने कहा कि इस प्लान में न्यूट्रलिटी नहीं है. ये जो जोन है इस प्लान में, ये ऑब्वियसली बाकी चीजों से अलग है, राइट? द सेंटर इज डिफरेंट फ्रॉम द पेरिफेरीज, राइट? हमेशा एक जगह पे पावर केंद्रित है, राइट? पावर इज कॉन्सेंट्रेटेड इन सम पोर्शंस ऑफ दिस बिल्डिंग. इट्स अनदर थिंग दैट who lives inside it and all is a different question, but the way the building is made is always showing power, right? और power दिखाने का procedure ही ये है कि show emphasis, emphasize portions where power is concentrated, right? That is how you rule by showing your power, right? तो अब वो जो है वो PWD is trying to move towards more of a neutral system of order, entirely abstracted from the personal experience of a perspectival. ये बहुत ही बड़ा वजनी phrase है. इससे ये कहने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि जब हम इस तरह की बिल्डिंग की कल्पना करते हैं तो इसमें आप समझिए कि ये बिल्डिंग बनाई ही गई एक ऑब्जर्वर के लिए है. इट हैज बीन मेड फ्रॉम द पर्सपेक्टिव ऑफ एन ऑब्जर्वर. क्यों? क्योंकि ऑब्जर्वर के ऊपर हम लोग अपना पावर दिखाना चाहते हैं. We want to show power to the observer, right? So if somebody is looking at this building, how do you make them feel that there is power, right? And where is it located? You do it by using very simple techniques, by massing the building in a way, कुछ इस तरह से बनाए कि पावर को हाइट के साथ, साइज के साथ आप उसको दिखाएं, राइट? दिस इज अ वेरी ओल्ड टेक्निक इन अ वैरायटी ऑफ कल्चर्स, सो इसमें कोई इतनी खास नई बात नहीं बोल रहा मैं. लेकिन पीडब्ल्यूडी का जो इंटरेस्ट है, दे आर ट्राइंग टू मूव अवे फ्रॉम दिस आइडिया ऑफ द पर्सनल एक्सपीरियंस ऑफ अ पर्सपेक्टिवल ऑब्जर्वर. उन्हें पड़ी ही नहीं है कि आप कौन है और आप समझ रहे हैं कि नहीं कि यहाँ पावर है, राइट? दैट इज नॉट व्हाट द एम्फसिस is in the PWD mode of architecture. And they're moving towards something what you call the pavilionation or the removal of a center, right? More often than not, they're not interested in this idea of a center where power resides. So Padanukram se mukti, they want to move away from this idea of a hierarchical understanding, but they're also going to create hierarchy in a different way. So let's not forget that they're also a very hierarchical organization, and therein lies the politics of the PWD, and that is where Grouse is going to come in. तो जैसे कि मैंने कहा कि पीडब्ल्यूडी को मुक्ति चाहिए इस तरह के आर्किटेक्चर से. सो पवेलियनेशन की बात हो गई. अब इसमें मैं कंटेम्पररी थियरीज को लाना चाहता था, क्योंकि इनकी भाषा से एक तरह से हमें कुछ समझ आता है कि द सेंटर ऑफ द न्यू बिल्डिंग्स इज नो लॉन्गर द हार्ट ऑफ द होल. यानी कि जो बिल्डिंग है उसका जो सेंटर है वो एक तरह से उसका बिल्डिंग, यू मेक द सेंट्रल पावरफुल पोर्शन इनटू द हार्ट ऑफ द बिल्डिंग, राइट? तो बिल्डिंग बनाने का मतलब ही ये है कि पहले आप आइडेंटिफाई करें कि सबसे पावरफुल चीज क्या है वहां पे, और उसको पहले आप दिखाएं, राइट? उसके बाद आप कुछ भी बनाते रहें, whatever else you make after you've emphasized power, you simply start fitting functions into those things, right? So the first function of the building is to show power. Then everything else can be fitted retrospectively into the other spaces, right? So which means, if you take a look at this plan, right, this is what you call symmetry. बीच में if you have a line, वो दोनों तरफ से एक तरह से मिररिंग हो रहा है उसी चीज का. उसका मतलब ये है कि पहले इस तरह की जो पावर को दिखाने की प्रोसेस पहले वो होगी, उसके बाद यू विल मिरर द फंक्शंस, उसके बाद आप ये तय करेंगे, आफ्टर दैट यू विल डिसाइड व्हाट फंक्शन हैज टू बी पुट इनसाइड दिस स्पेस, राइट? So this is not the way in which the PWD thinks, right? The PWD is thinking first purely in terms of functions. It's not thinking in terms of hierarchy or symmetries in terms of, it is though, but in a slightly different frame from this one, and we'll talk about that also in a second. So this is the core idea of the autonomization of the PWD. The PWD is autonomizing itself from the existing hierarchical perspectives, from a perspectival observer, from existing hierarchies, moving towards pavilion, towards the removal of a center, right? And this is an example of a PWD plan. So ये एक तरह से standard plan है, ये उनके railway branch का plan है. अब देखिए इसमें भी हायरार्की है, मगर इसमें एक चीज इंपॉर्टेंट आप नोटिस कीजिए कि अगर इस बिल्डिंग को आप देखें इसके प्लान में, तो उसमें कोई किसी को पड़ी नहीं है. नोबडी इज पर्टिकुलरली कंसर्न्ड अबाउट हाउ दिस स्पेस एंड दिस स्पेस आर सिमिलर और डिफरेंट. I mean, they are just similar, right? So you can have one office functionary working here, another office functionary working here, and they won't know the difference between this space and that space, right? It's just blandness. It's just the sameness of everything around, right? Nothing has emphasis. कोई फर्क नहीं है किसी भी चीज में यहाँ पे, right? तो इसका मतलब क्या है? What is the meaning of this? Which means, if you were to remove this particular room from here, if you were to remove this entire section from here, it will make no difference to the rest of the building, right? So which means that this part of the building does not depend upon that part of the building to make some meaning, right? Every part is functioning independently, every part looks alike, so it doesn't matter, कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता कि इसमें से आप कुछ भी हटा दें, क्योंकि this thing is not a single whole. It's just a collection of parts, and each part can look like the other part. Now if you imagine over here, if you look at this building, if you were to remove this entire thing won't make any sense, right? Because everything is centered around power, everything is centered around hierarchy. हर चीज यहाँ पे इस गुंबद से जुड़ी हुई है, तो इस गुंबद को ही हटा दो यहाँ से, तो उसका कोई मतलब ही नहीं रहेगा, क्योंकि वो बिल्डिंग will not be the royal pavilion, वो कुछ और ही बन जाएगा या बन जाएगी, right? So this is not the logic that you're actually seeing with the PWD. PWD's architectural philosophy is utilitarian. उनको क्या है, what they want is हमको अपना बिल्डिंग बनाना है सबसे सस्ते दाम पे, जितनी जल्दी हो सके. And that's partly also because they're a military organization, so a lot of their architecture is tied in with like going into places, very rapidly establishing political control over those locations, and very quickly setting up some kind of a bureaucratic organization, right? बहुत ही जल्दी में हमको जाना है, यहाँ पे हमको अपना झंडा फहराना है, और फिर यहाँ पे हमको एक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन इख्तियार करनी है. वी हैव टू क्रिएट एन एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ओवर हियर. तो जो अर्ली फेज है, देयर आर्किटेक्चर इज प्रिंसिपली अबाउट a very functionalist architecture, right? So unko, they are not interested in creating these complex appearances of power in many instances, but not always. So as I said, so this is the work which has actually been done by a particular scholar, Peter Scriver. Unke essay mein aapko, you'll find a lot of information on this. You should read Peter Scriver. He's a really good scholar. And very hard work he's done, from the 90s. You sort of see his dissertation onwards. So he gives a good history of like the PWD architecture and this whole rationalization and standardization which is happening within the utilitarian philosophy of the building public works department, right? And these are the people who are creating the infrastructure in the country. So infrastructure bhi banana hai, they're standardizing infrastructure because they believe that infrastructure is not architecture. Infrastructure is just standardized building which you need to do to get the basics going, and you get it done as fast as possible, right? So that is the philosophy you're looking at. So therefore, as I said, standardization of plans. And what you also see though is, now you take another example, which is this 1874 plan of a kacheri in Bombay. अब इसमें थोड़ा बहुत hierarchy नजर आएगा, इसमें थोड़ा बहुत you'll find symmetry. You can actually have a central axis over here, and you can see how the building is basically following some basic geometrical principles of symmetry and perhaps even hierarchy. Maybe the central portion is slightly higher than the rest. So you could say that, hey, the PWD is also thinking in terms of hierarchies. But yes, of course it is. But there's a crucial difference between what the PWD is doing and what was happening earlier. वो क्या कर रहे हैं? They're literally replicating this plan in huge parts of India. So it doesn't matter if you're in colonial Bombay or you're in colonial Bulandshahr. They're going to repeat these plans. So which means that even if you're seeing hierarchical plans, there is no difference between this plan in Bombay and a Kacheri plan which would be made in some other part of the country. So what you're seeing is that there is no hierarchical difference. In Bombay is just the same as anywhere else, right? So my point is that be it at the level of individual rooms, यानी कि एक छोटे स्तर पे आप देखें तो अगर ये एक एक कमरे के इनके बीच में समानता है, और यू लुक एट अक्रॉस रीजन्स, इस कचेरी के डिजाइन में और किसी और जगह की कचेरी के डिजाइन में देयर विल बी नो डिफरेंस, राइट? सो ये एक तरह के समानता जो है इनके आर्किटेक्चरल फिलॉसफी में, ये आपको खास दिखेगी पीडब्ल्यूडी के फंक्शनिंग में. एंड दिस इज वेयर द पॉलिटिक्स ऑफ द पीडब्ल्यूडी आल्सो स्टार्ट्स इमर्जिंग, जिसके बारे में भी हम बात करेंगे. तो मैंने वही कहा कि समानता जो है, और that is where when we actually started by saying कि ये जो छोटा टाउन है, यानी कि ये जो छोटे कस्बे हैं, क्यों हम लोग इन जगहों को बाईपास करते हैं, या फिर क्यों इन जगहों को, why do we forget these spaces, why are these spaces so unexceptional? That's the word I wanted to use, right? वो कुछ हद तक, to some extent, that is also the contribution of a certain building philosophy that comes from the public works department, which created so much standardization in the 19th century, especially in the latter part, that you could be traveling into any portion of the country, especially in the northern provinces, and you won't see any difference between the architecture there and other places, right? And that's the reason why, that a lot of these towns actually, and a lot of the infrastructure which was created at that time is not valued in the present. उसकी कोई कदर ही नहीं करता है, क्योंकि वो ऐसा infrastructure है जो उसमें और किसी और जगह में कोई फर्क ही नहीं देखते. इनफैक्ट आप कश्मीरी गेट में जाएंगे, if you go to Kashmiri Gate today, you will see such architecture there as well, right? And people don't know how to value these things because they don't see how they're exceptional in any way, right? And I think therein lies the question also of the small town as to why, what is the reason for their being unexceptional, purely in architectural terms, right? And there's a small contribution of the philosophy of the public works department in that. That's something that I wanted to highlight. Now, this is where you have Frederick, Salmond, Grouse come into the picture. So Grouse is a very interesting person with a lot of very interesting contributions, and of course controversial also. But that is a different story elsewhere told. But as of right now, I just wanted to show you what kind of a colorful character he is by actually showing you an image of a law court जो आज भी कायम है, आज भी मौजूद है बुलंदशहर में. And this is he's the district collector of Bulandshahr. And this is an image from a book by Thomas Metcalfe, which is an imperial vision, Indian architecture and Britain's Raj. But there's also, you can actually find this in Grouse's memoirs. थोड़ा सा टेढ़ा है, but I think you get the idea. Now, this is what Grouse has to say about this particular story. तो मैं पहले इसको इंग्लिश में पढ़ देता हूँ, फिर उसके बाद मैं हिंदी में इसका तर्जुमे करने की कोशिश करूँगा. So the most important government building in the Bulandshahr district is the set of law courts and revenue offices at headquarters. तो ये clearly बुलंदशहर में सबसे महत्वपूर्ण जो बिल्डिंग है वो उनके दौर में वो कहते हैं कि वो लॉ कोर्ट्स हैं और रेवेन्यू ऑफिस है जो हेडक्वार्टर्स उनके हैं वो ये है. अच्छा, जो फसाड है यानी कि जो इसका ये जो दिख रहा है इसको फसाड बोलते हैं. तो वो कहते हैं कि जो फसाड है वो that is 170 feet in length and may be adequately described as a long low wall pierced with a uniform row of round-headed cavities. यानी कि ये एक बहुत ही लंबी दीवार है और इसके अंदर ये आर्चेस हैं, राइट, इनको कैविटीज बोल रहे हैं. तो ये एक तरह से एक दीवार की बात कर रहे हैं, राइट, ये इसका जो फसाड है. तो अब वो कहते हैं कि there is no porch nor any other feature by which to distinguish the front from the back. ये लैक लगा दिया, बैक है. Nor on either side is any one doorway marked off from its fellows as a main entrance. यानी कि वही बात आ जाती है. वो कह रहे हैं कि there is no difference between this arch and 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 this arch. There is no porch. यानी कि porch जो होती है एक तरह से एक you can say एक मंडप कह सकते हैं. जो एक पोर्च होती है वो पोर्च भी नहीं है यहाँ पे. तो अगर पोर्च कहीं बना देते, कोई यहाँ पे पोर्च बना देते, तो उसका मतलब है कि उस जगह को महत्व मिल जाती, राइट. तो कोई एम्फोसिस ही नहीं है यहाँ पे, किसी भी चीज पे कोई एम्फोसिस नहीं है. तो अगर आप इस बिल्डिंग का ये हिस्सा काट के अलग कर दें तो इस बाकी जो the rest of the building will not be affected at all. So if you remove one portion of the building, it has no impact on the rest of the structure, right? Because this is not organized hierarchically, this is not a whole, right? इसमें एक बहुत important word है WHOLE. So this is not thought of as a whole, it is just thought of as a collection of parts, random parts, and every part looks just like the other, right? So he says there is no porch nor any other feature by which to distinguish the front from the back. यानी कि आप इसके पीछे खड़े हो आप आगे खड़े हो कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता, right? Nor on either side is any one doorway marked off from its fellows as a main entrance. So the design could answer equally well or indeed much better for a dry goods store, a barrack or a factory. तो आप इसमें बैरक बना दे, इसको फैक्ट्री बना दे, इसको ड्राई गुड स्टोर बना दे, कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ता, राइट. बिल्डिंग तो वही है जो हर चीज के लिए काम आ जाएगी, क्योंकि इसको किसी ने कोई इसकी कोई पहचान नहीं, क्योंकि इसको nobody has tried to give it an identity of any kind, right? So no stranger unfamiliar with the economic eccentricities of Anglo-Indian administration could for a moment suppose that a building of such a mean and poverty-stricken appearance represented 1 million people and was the fiscal center of a district contributing over 14 lakh rupees to the annual revenue of the state. उसके बाद आगे भी बोलते हैं, इसका पॉइंट सिंपल है. He says कि कोई इस बिल्डिंग को देख के मान ही नहीं सकता कि ये बिल्डिंग जो है ये 1 मिलियन पीपल को रिप्रेजेंट कर रही है और एक ऐसे फिस्कल सेंटर का सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट बिल्डिंग है उस डिस्ट्रिक्ट का जिधर से 14 लाख रुपए एनुअल रेवेन्यू की तरह स्टेट में आ रहे हैं. तो ये आलम है. वो कह रहे हैं कि इतना बुरा है ये बिल्डिंग कि मतलब इट डजंट रिप्रेजेंट द एक्चुअलिटी ऑफ द डिस्ट्रिक्ट, राइट. और इधर से इतने पैसे आ रहे हैं, लेकिन ये मतलब आई गेस यू गेट द आइडिया. इसका मैंने हिंदी में ट्रांसलेशन किया था. आई थिंक आई लेट दैट बी, दैट डिड दैट विद गूगल ट्रांसलेट. So now let's talk about the politics of the PWD. अच्छा, अब ऐसा है, मैंने कहा कि PWD जो है, the PWD comes into existence principally as a military organization, right? उसमें ज्यादातर अब 1857 के बाद जो ब्रिटिश मिलिट्री है उसका दबदबा बढ़ जाता है. It is actually becoming more and more powerful. Why? Well, mostly post 1857, there is a kind of an attempt to actually quickly establish control, right, again in the provinces, and at the same time to in some ways construct and build very fast. वो क्यों? That is because immediately after the revolt, there is a massive need felt for infrastructure. जैसे कि किसी भी कस्बे में, into any town, if there is any thought of rebellion, they want to get troops in as fast as possible. So railway stations ko banana is very important, right? If you make a railway station, you can get in troops as fast as possible and quell any kind of disturbance. And at the same time, you want to improve and increase administrative efficiency. So the engineers who were actually beginning in the early portions of the PWD were all military engineers, because they are a part of the military, and the military is the most dominant force in the administration, given the circumstances. They continue to actually exercise their authority. वो अपना दबदबा जमाए हुए हैं और वो छोड़ना नहीं चाहते, right? तो पब्लिक वर्क्स डिपार्टमेंट के अंदर जो पॉलिटिक्स चल रही है, वो पॉलिटिक्स ही मिलिट्री इंजीनियर्स वर्सेस सिविल इंजीनियर्स है, राइट? इसके बारे में पूरा विस्तार में पीटर स्क्राइवर ने लिखा है, आप पढ़ सकते हैं. Peter Scribe has written extensively about this politics. So what you do see is that the military engineers dominate, right? और वो dominate करते कैसे हैं? They dominate by not allowing civil engineers to make their own buildings, right? So military engineers are constantly trying to de-hierarchize, right? वो पदानुक्रम को उससे मुक्ति पाना चाहते हैं. And civil engineers are always seen as a source of hierarchy. वो इसलिए because a lot of the civil engineers who are coming in are also coming in from very aristocratic families in England, right? तो वो जो वहां से इधर आ रहे हैं, उनके अंदर हायरार्की की टेंडेंसीज ज्यादा हैं. तो उनको दबाने के लिए they're standardizing architecture. They don't want to leave any room for civil engineers or even architects to come into the picture and create any kind of a new hierarchy in the public works department. The military engineers want to keep control, right? This is the politics of the PWD, right? तो अब it is against this, इसके खिलाफ, that Grouse sort of वो मुहिम छेड़ते हैं. He takes up this kind of protest against this. So a lot of his writing and his thinking in Bulandshahr, not just Bulandshahr, actually even in Mathura it's the case, but in Bulandshahr it actually reaches fever pitch. क्योंकि मथुरा में जो उन्होंने किया, whatever he did in Mathura, he was actually removed from Mathura for that reason. So he's kind of constantly being shifted so that like he's not allowed to continue in any one place for too long. यहाँ से वो फतेहपुरी चले जाते हैं. That is again, he's again shifted from Bulandshahr, right? So part of the idea is that he's becoming such a nuisance to the public works department because he's constantly contesting, their emphasis on hierarchy. तो और उनकी आर्किटेक्चर में खासकर आप नोटिस करेंगे जो वो पेट्रनाइज कर रहे हैं, जो लोगों के साथ वो रह के विद देयर लोकल पेट्रनेज के साथ वो वापस वही चीज ला रहे हैं. एक तरह से पहचान, एम्फसिस, हायरार्की, ये सारी चीजें वापस आ रही हैं, राइट? So I guess now you can probably also situate this in the larger context of this question of the small town, right? कि वो छोटे टाउन की पहचान भी वापस वो एक तरह से लाना चाहते हैं. He wants to bring back the identity of a smaller town, or at least make it not bypassable in our contemporary jargon, right? तो अच्छा, वैसे ये लॉ कोड्स कुछ इस तरह से दिखते हैं आज. और ये इमेज जो है ये मुझे काला चौपाल ट्रस्ट के लीनिका जेकब जी ने दिया है. And these are actually, she's actually working in Bulandshahr, and he's actually trying to work with Grouse's architecture, and there's some very commendable efforts being done to actually revive Bulandshahr's history. And I think the local communities are also deeply involved in this really fascinating project. So I got these pictures from them recently because I couldn't go during the pandemic. So I think these are the ways in which, and it's important to recognize that this is the architecture of the PWD. जो मैंने अभी आपको image दिखाया था, ये वाली चीज, right? So this image, I think it's important to recognize that even as this is an image that is not having an identity of its own, this building, it is a value to us because it is, I think we are also interested in de-hierarchization, right? So we cannot undervalue this legacy. तो हम लोगों को दोनों चीज में interest है. We also want the small town to come into our view. But we should not forget that the emphasis on de-hierarchization itself also has value to us, right? I mean, that it's another thing that the PWD has hierarchies of its own. We should not forget that. But the point is that the principle of de-hierarchization should not be forgotten. So for that reason alone, we should not completely overlook this architecture, right? And it should be preserved. So I think we have a very complex, society has every society, I guess, but history is very complex, and I think we can't cherry pick what we want to actually preserve, as much as we should understand that kind of complexity for what it is, right? And I think that's the nature of the conversation that we should be having as well. At any rate, this is a commendable effort at actually reviving this building and understanding it. And this is how the work is in the present. So just to give you a sense of it. So again, now coming back to Grouse, I think we've talked a lot about what Grouse was saying. Now let's see what he was doing, right? वो क्या कर रहे थे वहां पे बुलंदशहर में. तो ये एक तरह से उनकी जो बहुत ही important text है. इसके actually there he writes 3 memoirs on Buland, 4 actually, I think 3 or 4. So this is the second part, which is actually published by the Medical Hall Press in Banaras, which was quite a big publisher at that time. And Seedha on the title, on the front page, he sort of says, political abstractions are fast ruining the awakening intellect of India. तो वो सीधा politics में जा रहे हैं. Lekin we set that politics aside. Let's just look at what his buildings are doing. And there's some fascinating images over here, which he takes with the help of a photographer, Chunilal from Mathura. उसके बारे में अलग से कभी बात कर सकते हैं. But now we're going to come back into the meat of the question and emphasis. महत्व को महत्व कैसे दिया जाए, ये एक तरह से हमारा सवाल है. तो ये जैसे मैंने कहा कि ये एक उनके कार्यकाल में, this is the time period, in his time period, he patronized the creation of this gate. It does not exist today from what I've gathered. I was not able to find it when I was actually spending a lot of time in Bulandshahr. Over, I don't know, a decade and a half, I've been visiting it, but I have not been able to find this. But I do think it's one of the most extraordinary works in Indian architectural history. It's sad that it doesn't exist anymore. But, at a very simple level, let me just say right away, it's an entrance. It's an entrance, and there's an emphasis, right? There's clearly a sense in which there's a hierarchy, that this central portion of this entrance is distinguished from what is around it, right? It sounds very obvious, but I think you've got to recognize what it's pitted against. It's pitted against the Public Works Department, right? So this is the politics of architecture, right? And it's very conspicuously being embraced by Grouse. वो बहुत ही इसको जानबूझ के इस दिशा में ले जा रहे हैं, right? कि वो वापस आप इधर घुसने के समय ही आपको इस पार्क में ये एंट्रेंस का आपको महत्व समझना है, right? और ना सिर्फ वो इस चीज को इस तरह से बना रहे हैं, not only is he making it, he is actually writing about it, right? तो ये उनका description है. The boundary wall running parallel to the north veranda of the town hall is broken at the center by a little gate. ये broken word का बहुत ही he uses broken, यानी कि वो hierarchy को दिखाना चाहते हैं और वो break ला रहे हैं उस entrance structure में इस gate को बना के, right? And now please notice he also mentions this is immediately opposite the carriage drive leading up to the collector's house. Collector कौन है? Grouse है. So you can see how he's also trying to emphasize himself, right, in his own writing. So he clearly sees himself as also a very important locus or a center of authority in Bulandshahr, right? So in a certain sense, he's actually trying to reinvest and reinfuse this place with emphasis. वो महत्व को यहाँ पे वापस लाना चाहते हैं इस जगह से जहाँ पे महत्व एक तरह से पलायन कर गई है यहाँ से, राइट? तो वापस वो लाना चाहते हैं वो महत्व यहाँ पे. अच्छा, अब उनके पेट्रनेज में देखेंगे गेट्स के ऊपर उनका बहुत ज्यादा एम्फोसिस है. काफी सारे गेट्स हैं जो बुलंदशहर, खुर्जा, अनूप शहर में मैंने देखा नहीं है, लेकिन इन लोकेशंस में ग्राउस का पेट्रनेज है. मथुरा जाएंगे, आपको मथुरा में उनके गेट्स के पेट्रनेज के एग्जांपल्स मिल जाएंगे. तो ये जो गेट्स हैं, जैसे को महत्व देना, दैट इज समथिंग दैट इज रीइंट्रोड्यूसिंग इनटू द आर्किटेक्चर. He just said कि जो Indian architecture today is exemplified in new buildings in Bulandshahr, right? So when he's using the word new, he's basically fighting against the old, which is the PWD, right? But the new is also the old in a certain sense because it is returning emphasis into architecture, which is, when he says Indian architecture of today, he's saying that Indian architecture of today is something that is a revival of emphasis, right? And that emphasis comes through mostly in his emphasis on gates, which is a kind of emphatic architecture. क्योंकि ये जो emphasis कैसे? You see how this area distinguishes itself from the plainness of the surfaces next to it. So it's always trying to draw your attention from the observer's perspective, trying to bring the observer in, right, into this kind of notion of the emphasis on this space, right? So this is the Chapravat gate, as it's called. So it's to draw attention to this household, or this. No, I'm not sure if Chapravat is household, but it's a
Your,
location, right? So yeah, can you hear?
your screen share is not there if you're showing something.
Oh, it's not there. Okay, let me just try and
So
remove.
maybe stop and do it.
Oh, it stopped. Okay. Oh, okay. So it went off. All right. Give me a second. Now, can you see? Is it visible?
Yes, it is started.
Okay. Gates are actually a return to emphasis, right? And here too, as I was saying, he uses the word broken. The boundary wall is broken by this wicket gate. So this word broken is very important because he's trying to say that emphasis breaks the monotony of what is around, right? And so this area is actually emphasizing this walkway through as opposed to what is next to it, right? And so this notion of emphasis, यानी कि जो महत्व है उसको वापस लाना किस तरह से आर्किटेक्चर में वो गेट्स के माध्यम से by the means of gates and all sorts of decorations is actually trying to reintroduce. Of course, for anybody who's a student of architecture, architectural history, you know that these are like cusped, arches, which you oftentimes see in Mughal architecture. But we're not getting into that right now. We're just talking about the politics of this in the present moment of the latter part of the 19th century and the politics of the Public Works Department, against which Frederick Salmond Grouse is struggling and striving and fighting. More free image, which has actually been taken by the Kala Chopal Trust. Just want to share that. And here's another example, which is a Colvin gate. So there's a lot of gates that Grouse actually patronizes, right? And I just wanted to draw your attention to his description of this gate. I'm going to read out this and again try and translate this into Hindi. I just want to focus. One side of the main arch looking towards the garden, which says, in memory of Elliot Colvin, BCS, Commissioner of
मे भी तब तक हाँ बोलिए सर।
हाँ कंटिन्यू। यस निखिल।
नहीं मैं कह रहा था जितनी बातचीत अभी तक हुई है काफी इंटरेस्टिंग लग रही थी। मे बी जब तक वो लौटते हैं हम डिस्कस कर सकते हैं वही।
डेफिनेटली यस।
हमारे साथ आर्किटेक्ट्स हैं, डिजाइनर्स हैं, तो मतलब मुझे इंटरेस्टिंग ये लग रहा था कि एक तरफ जो वो डी हियरार्काइजेशन हो रहा है पीडब्ल्यूडी के तरफ से, एज इन उनकी जो बिल्डिंग्स हैं उसमें यूज वैल्यू पे ज्यादा फोकस है कि उनका बेसिकली क्योंकि 1857 का रिवोल्ट के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में वो कंजंक्चर वही है और आर्मी वाला स्टेट सिक्योरिटी ये सारे एस्पेक्ट्स हैं। तो जिस तरीके की आर्किटेक्चर इमर्ज कर रहा है उसका सीधा सीधा यूज वैल्यू है कॉलोनियल गवर्नमेंट के लिए। दूसरी तरफ जो ये फॉर एग्जांपल दिल्ली में लिक्वेंस का पूरा आर्किटेक्चर है या ये जो जिनकी बुलंदशहर में जो नाम था इनका, इनके बारे में जो बात करें, ये काइंड ऑफ एक दोबारा से रीएम्फसाइज जो कर रहे हैं एस्थेटिक्स पे, एक खास तरीके की रीहियरार्काइजेशन हो रही है इसमें, जिसका उस तरीके से यूज वैल्यू नहीं है बट एक खास तरीके की सब्जेक्टिविटी को इन्वोक करने के लिए या इन्फ्लुएंस करने के लिए एक खास तरीके की सब्जेक्टिविटी को पैदा करना या एक्सचेंज वैल्यू है उसकी, जो उसके मेकर्स हैं, जो उसके आर्किटेक्चर के बिल्डर्स हैं, प्लस जो व्यूअर है उसके बीच में एक एक्सचेंज हो रहा है। और उस एक्सचेंज में देखिए एक दरवाजे के इधर, मतलब दरवाजा अब इन्होंने काफी स्टिमुलेट किया दोबारा सोचने पे, इतने सारे दरवाजे हैं इंडिया में, दिल्ली में ही इतने दरवाजे हैं, फिर बुलंद दरवाजा, ये दरवाजा, तो मैं तो बड़ा इंटरेस्टेड हूँ क्या है दरवाजे के पीछे का पॉलिटिक्स, एस्थेटिक्स इतना मतलब फेटिशाइज कैसे है।
मुझे भी दरवाजे इसलिए इतने ज्यादा स्ट्राइक कर रहे हैं क्योंकि अगर दरवाजे ना हो तो क्या आपको एक्चुअली फील होगा कि आप यू आर एंटरिंग इनटू समथिंग विदाउट द प्रेजेंस ऑफ अ गेट और अ गेटवे दिल्ली में भी जैसे दिल्ली गेट, अजमेरी गेट, वो तो है ही। उसके अलावा जब आप बदरपुर में जाते हैं तो वहाँ बदरपुर में सीरीज ऑफ गेट्स हैं। अबोहर में भी मंडी के गेट्स, गलियों के गेट्स। तो ये सब कुछ टू एग्जेम्पलीफाई और उस पर रोशनी डालने के लिए कि यू आर एंटरिंग इनटू समथिंग। आजकल भी गेट्स हैं, RWA के गेट्स, जो सिंपल काले काले मेटल के गेट्स होते हैं, वो भी गेट्स हैं, बट वो भी फिर यूटिलिटेरियन वाली सेंस में ही कंस्ट्रक्टेड होते हैं यूजुअली। Anyone else wants to share something? They should.
No, I think what he has done, he has put his mobile on silent mode, so he can't listen to my phone call. Or dusra, he perhaps is giving lecture, still giving lecture without realizing that it has got disconnected. So I am still trying to get in touch. But आप लोग चालू रखिए इस discussion को. Professor Rita Garewal is also with us. I'm sure she also may have something to say on the gates.
Yes.
Amritsar has a lot of gates similarly, and I think gates are a very part and parcel of our Punjabi rural landscape also. And you see commemorative gates on possibly every village of Punjab. Some depending on the grandness of that particular village in terms of who has endowed money to construct that gate, but also in terms of sometimes memorialization of certain kind of villages. तो कभी-कभी क्या होता है किसी जो martyr के नाम पे गेट बना दिया जाता है. So gate seems to be an interesting gateway into the memory of that particular space also. So this interesting discussion. Let me just try calling Venu again, maybe in the meanwhile.
Also, I think sometimes the gateway, the time that it was built, the place that you were supposed to enter into does not remain, but the gate remains as a memory of that place you were supposed to enter into, the time that it was built in. So it's like a little remain of the history of that area that was supposed to be.
देखिए, एक तरफ तो मतलब दरवाजा है वो एनक्लोजर का काम करता है, अंदर और बाहर के बीच फर्क पैदा करता है, और ये उसका फंक्शन है, ये उसका यूज है. बट वही बात कि इतने ग्रैंड जो एंट्रेंसेस हैं, इतने बड़े बड़े हैं, उनका क्या मतलब है. साथ ही साथ ये भी मैं सोच रहा था कि जो PWD वाली जो बिल्डिंग्स थी, जो कि सिंपल यूज वैल्यू वाली थी, उनका कैसे, अगर मतलब जैसे अभी हो भी रहा है, वो कॉलोनियल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन का बिल्डिंग था, कोर्ट था, अब जो इंडियन गवर्नमेंट है उसको यूज कर रही है, तो इस तरीके के स्पेसेस कैसे रीयूज इनको करना का एक क्या कहते हैं, बहुत तरीके के रूप में आप उन्हें रीयूज कर सकते हैं. स्कूल भी हो सकता है, वो कैंटीन भी हो सकती है, शायद कॉमन्स, किसी भी तरीके के कॉमन्स वो बन सकते हैं. और इतने सारे दरवाजे हैं, सेम दिखते हैं, कहीं से भी आप एंटर कर सकते हैं. आई थिंक मल्टीपल दरवाजे हैं एज अपोज टू सिंगल ग्रैंड स्पेक्टेकुलर दरवाजा, एज अपोज टू जो ये. हाँ, तो ये तो है इस तरीके की बिल्डिंग्स जो रीयूज इनका हो सकता है काफी तरीकों से. पर जो ये जो स्पेक्टेकल्स हैं, जो स्पेक्टेकुलर दरवाजे हैं, उनका क्या यूज वैल्यू है, उनको कितना मतलब तरीके से आप रीयूज कर पाओ. अगर वो पावर के सेंटर्स हैं इन देयर आर्किटेक्चरल फॉर्म, तब शायद कोई और पावर ही उसमें बैठ सकती है शायद. कॉमन्स वहां पे, फॉर एग्जांपल कॉमन्स कैसे, क्या इमेजिन कैसे करेंगे कि इतने बड़े दरवाजे के, बुलंद दरवाजे के पीछे कोई कॉमन्स है, as opposed to a seat of power या even tourist spot जिसमें past है दरवाजे के पीछे. हाँ तो बस मैं random जो भी आ रहा है वो बोल रहा हूँ, बाकी लोग भी बोलेंगे.
दो जो बड़े दरवाजे हमें नहीं भूलने चाहिए हमारे देश के, वो एक तो गेटवे ऑफ इंडिया और एक इंडिया गेट. दोनों ही पावर को सिंबलाइज करने के लिए हैं, बट जो स्केल इन दोनों चीज़ों का है, आई डोंट थिंक वो कंपेरेबल है. क्योंकि आजकल जिसको तुम कह रहे हो रीयूज करना, अडेप्टिव रीयूज अपने आप में एक पूरा प्रोग्राम है जो फोर्ट्स का होता है, और विच आर प्रिटी इंट्रिकेटली डिजाइंड और पूरा हेजेमोनिकली पर्सपेक्टिव से वो देखते हैं, और सब कुछ दरबारें अलग और छतरियाँ अलग और रसोइयाँ अलग और जनाने अलग, सब इस तरह से बना होता है. वो भी रीयूज होते हैं इनटू म्यूजियम्स और गैलरीज और होटल्स और पब्लिक बिल्डिंग्स. बट तो मतलब मैं कह रही हूँ स्केल ऑफ बिल्डिंग एंड PWD बिल्डिंग और एक गेट दोनों बहुत अलग चीज़ें हैं. उनको कहाँ जोड़ा जा सकता है ये शायद वीनू से पूछ सकते हैं कि वो एक, क्योंकि ग्राउस का जो भी काम देखा है हमने अभी तक, इट्स मोर ऑफ अ फसाड वर्क. अ गेट भी है, इट्स लाइक ऑलमोस्ट अ फसाड ओनली as compared to a building that is more about अंदर का space, and a gate is just like a 2D surface that you enter into. So I think Veenu is here.
Hi. I'm so sorry.
welcome
My
back.
connection's gone. Sorry, what time did you lose me?
The gate is jinxed. That's what Yogesh says. The moment you reach the gate, it's haunted and you disappear.
Okay. So, well, I'll just quickly try and speak about it. I think you have the broader picture. I'll just try and... I wanted to say that... so what you see is like a lot of these buildings that he's actually patronizing are related to actually bringing back emphasis. And you see this not only in the forms of the gates, but you also see it in the way in which he's putting inscriptions on those gates, dedicatory inscriptions. So he's constantly trying to actually tell people that, look, these locations are not without identity. They're not like places which are, you can just bypass, right? There are living people over here, and you need to actually acknowledge that. And a lot of these constructions, he's actually drawing subscriptions from local, local sort of landowning communities, and also from those who are essentially people who have money lending communities, right? And why is he doing this? He's doing this obviously because the Public Works Department is not going to finance these things, right? Because their whole belief is different, their whole philosophy is different. So that's the principal idea, that he's actually trying to bring back a sense of placehood or placeness into this location. And what's interesting is that, like, and there are, I think I showed you which gate did you get to? Was it just the first gate, or was I able to get to at least 2 or 3 other gates?
We were on the gate with
Colvin Gate.
Windows.
Colvin Gate.
Colvin Gate. So you didn't see the example in Khurja that I gave. No. So I was speaking away merrily. I was not aware that I was obviously not having an audience.
I suspected that.
Yeah. So which was a bit like now I think it's a return of the perspective of the observer, I guess, into the situation. So I guess if one gateway closes, we'll have to use another. But anyway, that's what I was actually trying to show you. I was reading out some of his own descriptions of these works that he patronized. And what's interesting in a lot of these structures is that he's constantly trying to show you how, he keeps using the word broken, right? And he wants to break the monotony. So, and the word monotony is also something that he uses in his writing. So the idea of breaking monotony, either by the means of inscriptions or by the creation of gateways, the creation of hierarchies, is something that he's constantly trying to actually infuse into architecture. And of course, he's constantly saying that it's the locals who want to do this because they are paying money. So he's constantly also telling you how much money and has been paid in the form of subscriptions for these projects. So that's certainly something that he's doing. And I wanted to actually point out, however, at the end of this, in the last few slides, I was actually going to take you back in time from before that period to 1857, which is where you actually start seeing, interestingly enough, the first signs of actually identity emerging in buildings in a very strong sense in the early days of the PWD, because it is the war, which is the 1857, where a lot of the cantonment architecture, which is again standardized PWD architecture, is actually in some ways kind of attacked. So I was actually trying to get through with these photographs by Felice Beato, which many of you may be familiar with as this British photographer who comes in with General Colin Campbell, and like once he comes in with the reinforcements. So he's actually taking photographs of these sites of destruction after the event is over. So he's actually staging a lot of photographs of violence, including photographs of Kashmiri Gate. Well, I would just say that look up this particular, if you have Google, just look up Wheeler's Entrenchment, WHEELER''S, entrenchment, and just look for a photograph. It'll be from 1857, put in Beato, B-E-A-T-O. You will have an image of it. You'll see a lot of these photographs of ravaged buildings, right, including the residency in Lucknow. So a lot of the architecture is already sort of, gaining this kind of identity, which is like very kind of standardized architecture, which suddenly begins to assume identity in the forms of the memories of people. लोगों की यादें जुड़ जाती हैं उस जगह से, और वो यादें जुड़ती इसलिए हैं क्योंकि ये ब्रिटिश पब्लिक है, उनको भी चाहिए कि ये जो वॉर डेड है उनको याद किया जाए. तो ये जो फोटोग्राफ्स हैं ये इंग्लैंड जाती हैं बाकायदा, और वहां से फिर लोग आते हैं इन साइट्स को विजिट करने. कानपुर में लोग आते हैं, कानपुर मेमोरियल भी बनता है वहां पे. सो देयर इज अ होल कल्ट ऑफ मेमोरी इन द ब्रिटिश इमेजिनेशन, जिसके बारे में कई लोगों ने लिखा है. रोजी लेवलिन जोन्स हैं, कई स्कॉलर्स हैं, अब्दुल हलीम शरार हैं. तो ये सारे जो इमेजेस हैं ये ग्राउस के ये फेलिस बियाटो के इमेजेस हैं. और जो बियाटो है वो खुद क्राइमिया से आ रहे हैं, क्राइमियन वॉर से वो फोटोग्राफ्स करके आ रहे हैं. So he is also actually using certain techniques to actually show violence, जो बहुत ही staged भी है. तो मगर मेरा point उन photographs को दिखाने का ये था कि the larger idea is कि एक तो you have Grouse on the one hand, who is actually trying to infuse a sense of placehood in a small town like Bulandshahr, saying that it's not acceptable to have this kind of standardized pattern book form of architecture that is being created over here, right? And he's doing that by kind of breaking the monotony in all sorts of ways that he can. And he's, of course, recreating hierarchies also in the process. So that's also problematic. But on the other end, you already have from a time before Grouse, this cult of British memorabilia, which is actually producing sites of memory, which are tied in with identity, right? And which is the identity of violence. So what you'll see in these photographs is that the standardized architecture, you see Wheeler's Entrenchment in particular, it's a barrack, right? Which is again the same kind of architecture that you see in the Bulandshahr law courts. The same kind of, loggia or arches with no difference between each other. It's a barrack architecture, it's a military architecture made by utilitarians, made to be at the lowest possible price and the fastest possible speed, right? That kind of architecture also can assume identity if you actually start looking at the bullet marks and the cannon holes within it. So identity sort of accrues in all sorts of strange and unexpected ways, right? So much so that actually one of the more famous photographs, if you look for Kashmiri Gate in Beato, right? You'll see that famous image of Kashmiri Gate with all these cannon holes within it. That also sort of produces a sense of memory and belonging, right? Even today, if you actually walk next to that gate, that road is called Nicholson Road, right? जो Nicholson साहिब थे, उनको साहिब बोलते थे, I guess उस समय, whatever we can say today in the present, given the post-colonial imagination of ours. So I'm not sort of saying that he's a Sahib. I'm just saying that is a general. But he's known at that time as Nicholson Sahib. That road is again named after him, right? So there is a very clear, because he died over there. So there is a sense in which these memories also, and they still survive in different ways. People are indifferent to them in the present, understandably. But the point is that like placehood is something that is constantly sought, right? And the means, of course, of achieving it are different through photography that Beato does, or through the kind of photography that Grouse patronizes, the buildings that he's patronized, right? And that was also, I was sort of trying to bring that all together at the end and say that, look, if you're actually talking about this idea of a small town and the bypassability of a small town, the anonymity of a small town, right? And उस छोटे शहर की पहचान फिर कैसे कायम करें और क्यों करें, उसको समझने के लिए मैंने कहा कि ये 19वीं शताब्दी की जो एक लेटर हिस्ट्री है, उसमें एक उदाहरण स्वरूप ये दिखता है कि पब्लिक वर्क्स डिपार्टमेंट का जो पॉलिटिक्स है, उसके तहत हाउ वी बिगिन टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस आइडिया ऑफ प्लेसहुड, राइट? तो कॉन्टेक्स्ट अलग था उस समय का, पॉलिटिक्स अलग था, लेकिन desire for placehood was similar. Of course, we don't have the same politics today. We have very different politics. But one small part in our ability to bypass and forget small towns in the present, a small part of that may be this long-lasting colonial legacy of standardizing construction, which, as I was also indicating, has its own value because it is also trying to de-hierarchize. So I don't think we can wholly do away with it. It is also hierarchical in two different ways. It is the hierarchy of the military engineers on the one hand, and the second thing is that it also creates classes or cadres of people based upon their rank. And so the sizes of the rooms can be varied, but the architecture will remain rather standardized. I think that's as much as I'd actually wanted to end with. Yeah. So sorry about this.
We actually had a long discussion, Professor, when you were not there and you were gone for long.
No, it's okay. I'm sure you had a fun chat, but tell me, what were the thoughts?
Before that, I just realized, I mean, the title said People's Architecture.
Yeah.
So within this struggle for, I mean, Public Works Department or जो ये हैं
Grouse.
हाँ, Grouse. उनके बीच में जो टसल है, एक तरफ वो de-hierarchized functional use values in the form of buildings produce हो रही हैं, जो आप कह रहे थे कि hierarchies उसमें उस तरीके से visible नहीं है, और ये एक खास जो crowds हैं, ये certain aesthetics के जरिए वो एक हायरार्की दोबारा प्रोड्यूस कर रहे हैं, बट उससे एक आइडेंटिटी भी फॉर्म हो रही है शहर की. तो इन ये स्ट्रगल तो दिख रहा है, बट पीपल्स आर्किटेक्चर किस तरीके से समझा जाए, मतलब पीपल आर सब्जेक्ट्स टू दीज बिल्डिंग्स, बट उनका मूवमेंट, मतलब वो तो सब्जेक्ट्स हैं, तो उनका आर्किटेक्चर कैसे है?
That's a good question. See, I think the question is the language of autonomy, when we say, right? Central to that is the idea of the will, right? It's an architecture which is based on the will of people, if supposing you were to say people's architecture. Will, of course, is a very significantly political concept, right? And it involves a sense of agency, a sense of freedom, right? So what you see specifically in the language of Grouse, let me just first of all talk a little bit about will. I think maybe that will explain how I came to that question of people's architecture, because there was a question of people's will. So will as a political concept usually is something which is tied in with the idea of freedom and free will. When you say will, you say free will most of the time. By free will, you usually imply that the will is not governed by any other agency, right? The freedom to go by your own will, not by the will of any other, right? Not by the decrees and terms of others. That's the very simplistic definition of free will that we imagine and understand. So, which also means that will cannot have a precedent, which means that if will had a precedent, then it is by the decrees of others. So will cannot come with memory. Will is always your own. Will is what is outside of the past. Will always be new, right? So if you actually see Grouse's writing, there's a very strong emphasis on newness, right? He's saying that this is an architecture, sure it is the public works department that he's fighting against, but he's constantly trying to say that this is an architecture which is new, which is the people's will, right? It is what people desire, which cannot be anticipated by any centralized agency, right? So he's constantly hiding oftentimes behind this rhetoric that if only the centralized forms of governance had actually let people do what they want to do by themselves, then we would be much better at administrating this empire, right? So there is a deeper kind of a political kind of a philosophy also. He also sort of cites Taine, Hippolyte Taine, and he's reading people in France, for instance, at this time, and he's also talking about, so whenever he's saying that the new buildings in Bulandshahr district, he's saying there could be no precedent to this, which means that it is coming out of some collective will, which is purely some kind of a democratic structure, which is producing this kind of sense of autonomy from the public works department. And the principal evidence that he gives to that effect is the finance part, where he constantly says that this money is coming from the people, right? And mostly he's saying that also because now it's another thing that most of the people who are giving this money are the elites, right? So I'm not saying that like this is something which is actually the will of all the people. Rather, it is again a hierarchical form where there's a domination of the will of a few over the others as a representative will, right? So I think to that extent, he's using the language of politics, he's using the language of will, he's using very much in mobile, because the word new itself is an indication that it is will. Newness always implies will, because only that which is new cannot have a precedent. And will is precisely that which cannot have precedent because it is outside the decrees of anything that exists. That is free will, that is human freedom in the political sense. So he's very much steeped in that idea of freedom, right? But it's another thing that in the process he creates again a kind of the kind of heteronomy, a kind of a hierarchy, where it is the will of a few, which is the decrees of a few, which stands in for the decrees of, for the will of all, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that you can begin to see where in his specific biases, which come through rather strongly in many of the buildings that he's actually taking up. Mm-hmm. So that is close to an answer. And that's what I think I was struggling to sort of say, that even in terms of like trying to understand something that is representative, the keyword is representative of the people, right? Mm-hmm. Inherent within the language of will itself is domination, mm-hmm. right? That because it always becomes the will of the majority, the will of landed gentry, the will of those who have superior purchase in some way. So mm-hmm. inherent within will is this kind of autoimmune tendency to also then become domination of a kind, right? So I think he's not innocent of that kind of politics, Grouse. Mm-hmm. But that being said, I think like it is also true that he's fighting against another form of domination, which is the domination of the military engineers. So I think we have to see both perspectives in that sense. So I don't know if that answers your question, but this was the kind of space that I was coming from.
जी जी हम जो पहले एक्चुअली डिस्कस कर रहे थे, और हाँ विल का जो आपने बताया, आई थिंक वो फ्रांस में जो हाउसमैन और मतलब पेरिस, वहाँ की जो क्रोनोलॉजी चल रही है एज अपोज टू इंग्लैंड का यहाँ पे इंटरवेंशन, मतलब पेरिस कम्यून हो रहा है, उसके बाद कुछ सालों बाद हाउसमैन आ रहा है एक एस्थेटिक अपनी कैटेगरीज लेके। इधर 1857 हुआ है जिसमें एक खास तरीके की फंक्शन बेस्ड आर्किटेक्चर खड़ा हो रहा है जो कि पीडब्ल्यूडी द्वारा। और फिर ये जो है ये एक एस्थेटिक्स दोबारा से जगाने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, एक आइडेंटिटी उस तरीके की। तो हमारी बात हो रही थी अगर पीपल्स के तरफ से ही देखें तो क्योंकि ये जो पीडब्ल्यूडी द्वारा बनाई गई बिल्डिंग्स हैं वो उनको अगर यूज वैल्यूज की तरीके से देखेंगे तो व्हेन द पावर शिफ्ट्स और इज कैप्चर्ड then these kind of buildings can be reusable, can be reused. उनकी जो उनका reuse काफी तरीके से हो सकता है
जी,
जिसमें कॉमन्स के तरीके से भी हो सकता है या फिर इंस्टीट्यूशनल भी अगर रीयूज है तो काफी काइंड ऑफ इजी है एज अपोज टू जो स्पेक्टेकुलर आर्किटेक्चर है। फॉर एग्जांपल दिस ग्रैंड गेट्स जो कि हमेशा इनसाइड और आउटसाइड के बीच एक जो खड़ा रहता है एक डिवाइड करने के लिए। तो अगर पीपल्स के एंगल से देखें तो जो सेंटर्स ऑफ पावर हैं उस तरीके की जो ग्रैंड बिल्डिंग्स हैं उसमें एक तरफ लगता है कि शायद नई पावर आके ही बैठ सकती है, आम लोग उसमें क्या कर पाएंगे इसका इमेजिनेशन एक तरफ, और दूसरी ये जो क्या बोलते हैं मोनोटोनस सो कॉल्ड मोनोटोनस बिल्डिंग्स हैं इसका लोगों का इसको रीयूज करना की इमेजिनेशन काफी मतलब पॉसिबिलिटीज उसमें ज्यादा दिखती हैं कि नहीं?
हाँ, वो आप कह सकते हैं, लेकिन इसमें एक एक्स्ट्रा बिट ऑफ इंफॉर्मेशन आपको देना चाहिए मुझे, क्योंकि हमारे पर्सपेक्टिव से आज के दौर से अगर हम देखें तो हमें ऐसा लगता है कि जो यूटिलिटेरियन आर्किटेक्चर है वो सच में वाकई यूटिलिटेरियन ही है और उसका आज भी वही यूज किया जा सकता है जिस तरह से क्रिएटिवली वी कैन यूज इट फॉर डिफरेंट फंक्शंस, और उसकी एक ब्लैंडनेस और एनोनिमिटी जो है वो शायद अच्छी है, क्योंकि then we don't have to worry about like the way in which power kind of resurfaces. फर्क बस इतना है कि ग्राउस के हिसाब से खासकर जो लैंडेड जेंट्री है बुलंदशहर की, जो जिस दौर में वो वहाँ के जो डिस्ट्रिक्ट कलेक्टर थे वो कह रहे हैं कि लैंडेड जेंट्री अपने घर पीडब्ल्यूडी के आर्किटेक्चर की तरह शुरुआत में बना रहे थे। सो ही सेज कि पीडब्ल्यूडी आर्किटेक्चर का लोकल लेवल पे इम्पैक्ट ये था कि दैट वाज सीन एज अ सेंटर ऑफ पावर। तो अब वक्त की बात है कि आज हमको लगता है कि वो ब्लैंड है, लेकिन हो सकता है जो जब ग्राउस कह रहे हैं कि इट वाज आल्सो एन आर्किटेक्चर ऑफ पावर एट दैट टाइम। ब्रिटिश नजरिए से वो यूटिलिटेरियन भले ही रहा हो, लेकिन फ्रॉम द कम्युनिटीज पर्सपेक्टिव दिस इज अ सेंटर ऑफ पावर and that is why it was being emulated. We don't know how much to trust him also. Sometimes he can be a bit exaggerating things, but the point is that historically situate करना भी थोड़ा बहुत जरूरी बन जाएगा इसमें, क्योंकि the British were powerful. So whatever they were doing is these are the accoutrements of power. ये शक्ति का एक बल का एक वो है, प्रदर्शन है। भले ही वो उसको उस तरह से ना देखें, लेकिन वो इतने शक्तिशाली थे उस समय, तो लोग तो बेशक प्रभावित हुए होंगे, ये भी मानना पड़ेगा। तो दैट्स व्हाट आई थिंक, इट्स अ सब्जेक्टिव थिंग कि आज के दौर में अगर हम कहते हैं कि ये पावर इस तरह से दिखाने की बात है, वो शायद हमेशा ना रहे। देयर कैन बी वेरिएशंस हिस्टोरिकली, लाइक सिचुएटिंग इट हिस्टोरिकली इन डिफरेंट कॉन्टेक्स्ट में इट इज ट्रू दो ब्रॉडली, मगर नॉट ऑलवेज द केस कि हायरार्किक स्केल जिस तरह से रिप्रेजेंट करते हैं उसमें, जैसे कि आप अगर कंप्लीटली अनकनेक्टेड कॉन्टेक्स्ट में इजिप्शियन हायरोग्लिफ्स में देखें, साइज इज हाउ अथॉरिटी इज डेमोन्स्ट्रेटेड, राइट? बट दैट डजंट मीन इट अप्लाइज एवरीवेयर. So I think like size oftentimes is representative of power, but not always. And it also depends. It's not just the building, which is a sort of an assertion of power. There's a lot of other cultural equipment which has to go along with it. So it would not just be enough to simply change like the ruler, or to change moving from space to space, because there is a lot of other things that the British also brought with them, right? And those language and all of these things which have created these hierarchies, which won't go so easily. So that's just sort of a cautionary note, but your point is well taken.
थैंक्स. मैं बस लोग का मैं इसलिए काउंटर क्वेश्चन नहीं कर रहा हूँ, बस मैं बोल रहा हूँ कि मुझे प्रॉब्लम सुंदर आर्किटेक्चर से नहीं है, फिलिस्तीन वाला आर्गुमेंट नहीं है. और मैं बस क्योंकि पीपल्स की बात हो रही थी इसलिए बोल रहा था. मैं समझ रहा हूँ
बात सही है. नहीं, बेसिकली क्या है कि पीपल के बीच में डिबेट होना चाहिए. There has to be, I think, like if you say a people's architecture, it's basically a kind of a democratization of the will, which means किसी एक का will बाकियों को पराधीन ना करे, right? Which means will always has to mean that there is a collectivization and a conversation, right? And it emerges in conversation. It does not precede conversation. It will always be new. It will always be unexpected, right? So Grouse's language is redolent with that idea of the emergence of will. But it is another thing that it is the will of a dominant few. So I think, so he uses the right language, but the practice on ground may not have borne out the kind of language of democratic conversation that he was actually promoting. That at least the evidence seems to point in that direction.
Venu, I have just shared few of the images. If you can see this slide.
Sure, I can see. Yeah, that is actually the bathing ghats in Bulandshahr, जो काली नदी है, वो आज भी है. थोड़ा सा बहुत ही बुरे हाल में था अभी तक.
So which part is actually Salmond's here? So is it the bridge, or he's just showing photographs of the existing forms?
नहीं, ये पूरा ब्रिज उसने बनवाया है.
Okay.
उन्होंने बनवाया है.
Okay, and also these small minarets, as you can see in front.
Yeah. Those kiosks and all have been under his. I mean, of course, with the money from the local communities. There is also Raja Lakshman Singh, who's like actually, one of the other big patrons, and who's actually writes a memoir of Bulandshahr from before. So Grouse depends a lot upon him, and Nika Jacob at the Kala Chopal Trust. This is actually the shops which he creates. So he gets these kind of brick platforms. इसका अभी almost नामो निशान नहीं है location पे, but he creates these kinds of public spaces. He's very much interested in public spaces, and obviously the law courts are the spaces that he spends the most amount of time. That's mostly because everybody is caught up in litigation in Bulandshahr at this time, and so he's constantly saying, "आप लोग फालतू में कोर्ट में पैसा व्यर्थ कर रहे हो, मुझे पैसे दो, बिल्डिंग बनाते हैं." That's roughly what he's implying a lot from time. Not roughly, actually. He's very specifically saying that in his memoir. He says they're wasting their money on litigation because there's a lot of land and property related litigation that's happening at this time. So he's clearly very strongly against the courts, and therefore he feels that this kind of public utilitarian architecture, would be much better. So that's something that he's patented. This is one of the instances where he's actually doing something which is directly for the public, apart from, of course, the residences and specific instances which you're looking at.
Venu, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So it's just coming from the talk, a general question which can relate to the city or to the concept that you're bringing in. Is it possible to have banality, a banal structure, which is a very commonplace, ordinary looking structure, go along with aesthetics and functionalism? Because most of the arguments have been like what Corbusier is also doing, that what is functionalist doesn't have to look aesthetic. So is it possible that the three come together? Are there any examples of it where banality, aesthetics, and functionalism can all come together?
Well, I mean, among the three categories you mentioned, banality, aesthetics, and functionalism, two are political projects always, aesthetics and functionalism. what is function, who defines it is, again, it's completely tied in with specific philosophies of functionalism, and they can vary from context to context and from political situation to political situation. Same with aesthetics, that aesthetics is oftentimes, like some kind of a way by which you designate that which is aesthetically pleasing, and often also use that in city improvement drives, which actually disenfranchise a lot of people. So aesthetics can have that kind of very coercive and terrifying component to it. So to that extent, these are oftentimes subjective or political will-based forms of expression, function and aesthetics. I mean, there is no one definition which kind of survives universally over periods of time. At least as a trained art historian, that's what I would say. So to understand any aesthetic, it will first of all be important to situate it in the context. And the modern movement, on the other hand, which actually came up with this idea that like form follows function, and this idea that there is some aesthetic in simply doing just sticking to function. That's also got its own politics. That also comes with a certain kind of an emphasis on certain kinds of materials of construction, with the kind of mass mobilization of concrete, for instance, beton root. It's a certain kind of a material that allows for spanning large spaces, which then introduces its own sort of new kind of autonomous aesthetic, right? And it's also there the kind of the new emergence of like a certain kind of a civil engineer as the new purveyor of aesthetics of large spaces. So there's a whole way in which modernism brings with it its own forms of hierarchies and ways of producing aesthetics on a wholly different plane, right? Even as it smashes old hierarchies, even as it sort of says that like, we want to remove this kind of particularity of place, right? And create a whole new conception of place. So that's there. Banality, on the other hand, is a slightly different category. I think like, of course,
I mean,
banality,
just to add that, the moment we say the ordinariness of the court, there's no aesthetic as if in that building. But the moment we look at the other kind of the garden, the gateways you're showing, there's an aesthetic attached to particular places. So why is it that what is an ordinary or day-to-day or PWD buildings, why are they associated with being banal and being something really which cannot be looked as aesthetic?
No, there are specific historical reasons for that, which is I'm saying that the PWD, so you have to understand the history of the PWD in the 19th century. There's two moments in it, right? I think Peter Scriver talks about it this at length, but just to quickly synoptically give you that history. The first moment of the PWD is where they're simply setting up a lot of buildings because they need to get things going, right? Infrastructural development is the big push. So in that sense, they want to get as much done as possible within a very short period of time. So they develop new methods. So a lot of the architecture obviously began somewhere, right? So they first created a certain basic template, and then that template is repeated ad nauseum. But it was created at a certain moment in time. So all of these buildings, which Grouse is also rejecting, actually have some original moment where they were created, right? Then they simply start repeating those plans and elevations. They simply start making those things again and again and again in the latter part of the 19th century. So what happens with the PWD is early on, the PWD is simply trying to create a lot of infrastructure because it wants the British administration to take root more strongly in India, right? With the passing over the authority to the crown. They want India to become a very significant colony. And they see that this infrastructure that they're creating is a means towards that end, right? But what happens subsequently by the end of the 19th century is that the infrastructure becomes the end unto itself, right? So there's a massive shift. So the PWD is not really interested in knowing why it's creating the infrastructure. They simply want to replicate the patterns that they'd already created, right? And there's a whole new administrative corps that emerges in the PWD that's simply responsible for simply recreating things. So the PWD becomes only interested in its own continuing existence.
Oh, thank you.
So,
I think replication takes away that aesthetics, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So therefore, that kind of blandness which Grouse is actually protesting has a very specific history in the arc of the PWD's own evolution.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Venu. I just have a small question of obviously a space that you are not familiar with. And this is Abohar, where the project is located. And this may be a naive question. Please excuse me if I'm asking something very really stupid. Now, within this modern town that these fellows are working on, you had these two set of spaces. One space which was the pre-colonial, not pre-colonial actually, which was which was established somewhere around 1838. So you have this old Muslim Rajput town area, or Basti actually, the appropriate is Basti, which had these Rajputs, immigrants who had come from Rajasthan, got settled there. So they construct their own households, many of them in Shekhawati, and some which got reconstructed later in much more mix of the Shekhawati and the modern styles, the colonial styles. So now around the latter part of the 19th century, the British, because of its huge agrarian expansion in the area, see the need to have a mandi for sale of the produce, which is of varied kinds, from millets to wheat to cotton. Cotton actually was one of the largest. And therefore they construct what was known as the old mandi now, where these all produce will come. Now, interestingly, along with that, obviously, will come the colonial architecture, as you were very rightly pointing out. The Kachehri will come. Some of the other civil military complexes will also start emerging, which follow the same pattern that you were elucidating about. How do they look like? The similar kind of arches, the similar kind of segmentation of rooms. In fact, our project office is situated in one of such monument, which used to be military hospital earlier. Now, but the interesting part was when the new town was laid. So on the one hand, you had Mandi. On the other side, you had these gullies, the 12 gullies, which are established to sustain the Mandi in terms of communities from who were engaged in agriculture, from communities who would be doing money lending, who will be small traders, and there are all kinds of communities who have been settled also here. Now, there is a huge contrast between what the colonial government is constructing from the standpoint of public works, in the form of markets, in terms of municipal buildings, things. But on the other hand, you have this huge contrast of what is people constructing during that particular period. I'm talking about just around the period of the late 19th, early 20th century. I'm not going later than that. What the communities who have got settled here are constructing, which means these communities predominantly from region that we call Bagar, constituting of South Haryana, South Punjab, and North Rajasthan. They are constructing buildings on a very Shekhawati, Rajasthani style. I'm talking about residences and also their shop establishments. So on the one hand, you have a colonial edifice emerging as utilitarian forms of buildings. On the other hand, you have these business communities. I'm talking about predominantly business communities who are being brought here to sustain business of the Mandi, the circulation cycle of the Mandi. They are constructing monuments of a very distinctive non-colonial style. So how do you understand this contrast of, they are not the one who are adapting to the colonial style? At least I'm saying the beginning of the city's formation. In fact, all the buildings that you see in the older part of the city which have survived are all of the Shekhawati styles, predominantly adapting to some of those styles. Not using, you do see usage of circular arc in some of these buildings, but that's a functional usage to construct a veranda or something of that. But entire courtyard is in Shekhawati style or otherwise. Even in fact, how you approach the gateway of the house in entire Shekhawati style. So this contrast is very striking. when you look at the older city, which have been constructed by the British, by the way. Remember, I'm telling you, but that is the place of residence. On the other hand, you have place of business, you have place of administration. Why do you think this huge contrast exists?
There could be a reason for that. There could be a reason. Actually, Grouse has something to say about this. So, one interesting thing he says is that I was telling you about the landed elites, whom he's actually taking subscriptions from, and he's also contrasting their patronage with the patronage of the money lending communities in Bulandshahr. And he's saying there's a different way. So he says, for instance, everybody is working with local craftsmen, right? So he says that the landed elites are actually more inclined towards, in Bulandshahr, more inclined towards actually emulating the architecture of the British, right? He says, but the money lending classes seem to have a very different relationship with craftsmen, that they allow a lot more freedom to the craftsmen. So he says that the houses of the money lenders oftentimes are much more creative also in the sense of absorbing local traditions and, in this case, perhaps even Shekhawati traditions. A lot of this also has to do with the kinds of workmen that the people are actually employing, and the skills that they bring onto the table. So the British might be hiring wholly different people to work for them. Notice also, see, in British construction of the standardized PWD type, execution of the building also plays a huge part in its appearance. Right? And I'm not talking about something like Connaught Place, although I would imagine Connaught Place also being terribly different from this idea. It's basically these Georgian kind of columns and Palladian architecture of a certain kind, but that's a different story. The simple point is that when a drawing is being made, which is a plan, elevation with specifications, which is being sent to the site for construction, it is open to interpretation, true, but you're standardizing things so much that they can be built very fast without too much interpretation, right? So the site engineer can simply build it without necessarily relying on any creative input from any local craftsman or anybody who is the worker, who is actually going to create this thing. Now that is fundamentally different from the kind of patronage that you're actually seeing by the local money lending classes. That's what Grouse is saying, that he's saying that because they are in control of their own finances, and because they are not beholden to because they have their own money, they're not beholden to the diktats of like a standardized plan. They have the time also, because it also involves time. Creativity or freedom of expression to create anything which is not standardized would involve more time. So they're able to invest that much more time with the craftsmen to get what they want. So that's something that he sees as a difference in the patronage. And he certainly says that the landed elites want to actually ally themselves more with the British in some parts of Bulandshahr. So therefore, it may be the case that the town also gets sort of stratified into these kinds of locations where the money lending communities in particular do have a different kind of way with the craftsmen than, say, the other part of town. That's something that you see. Also, I think a lot of this has been done in terms of work on Calcutta. John Archer, for instance, has written about Calcutta and the kind of distinction between the white town and black town, and how the mansions and the Jalsha gods and all of those things in Calcutta sort of emerge. A slight remove from the more the British colonial portions of the city. So there is work on that, but I think that's still working too hard with the black town, white town kind of distinction. I think we need much more granularity on that question. I think just using that black town, white town thing, that was important for the time that it came up. Today, we need to have a much more granular approach, that we can't just close it off by saying black town, white town. Rather, we need to understand patronage a little more systematically with greater detail, looking at individual families, genealogical charts, craftsmen. What is the nature of the relationship with them? How do forms and ideas travel, say, from Shekhawati to Abohar? I think those kinds of histories should now be possible, perhaps, with a little more granularity than just simply creating that sharp, But anyway, that's a beginning point for sure, but not the end point.
No, thank you. That makes sense actually, because at least in the part of the town that we are trying to work with, you have a lot of Artiya money lending at these communities, and I can see the pattern that you are saying. But yes, obviously, this is something that we have to explore further to try to get into the more nuances.
Understand agency. Agency is very important to understand.
Right. So we'll try to do that. In fact, this is an interesting input that you have given to us. Maybe Prachi may follow it up at some point of time. She also has an architecture training. But thank you. Any other question that Prachi you would want to take? Otherwise, we are already at 8 o'clock. Beyond the slotted time. Prachi?
No, I don't have any further questions.
I'll just add one last point, actually. Yes, I think if you're looking at Abohar in Punjab, you should look at the Mayo College, the Mayo School.
Right.
The history of the Mayo School. I think Abdul Halim, Halim Tarar, I've forgotten his name, he's a Pakistani scholar. He's actually worked on that and how that school, it actually has a sharp distinction between its crafts training program and its art program. And how United Punjab actually had a very sharp difference between this kind of hierarchization of art versus craft. And I would not be surprised if some of the building traditions that you're seeing oftentimes are tied in more with the craft tradition. And that might be something to also explore as a suggestion if you're specifically looking at Punjab.
Right. Though we don't find those kinds of monuments in this part of Punjab because this is actually close to Rajasthan. So perhaps this would be more attuned to understanding what you call the Maja or the Doaba areas of Punjab. There are actually monuments of those styles. And even Kapurthala, I would say, when you come to Malwa, the lower part, but not so down south from in Punjab. This becomes very close to a different style, different form, different cultural zone. But yet again, I think it's an important, we'll try to look at Mayo School also. But thank you very much. Prachi, over to you now.
सॉरी मुझे कुछ क्लिक कर रहा है, प्लीज मैं बोलना चाह रहा हूँ ताकि वो रजिस्टर हो जाए. तो बेसिकली मेरे ख्याल से क्या हो रहा है कि जो घर बना रहे हैं तो पुराना जो गिल्ड्स हैं जो क्राफ्ट्समैन कि जो फ्यूडल पीरियड से एसोसिएट होती हैं वो लोग घर बना रहे हैं. जिसका मास्टर क्राफ्टमैन है वो ट्रैवल भी कर रहा है, शेखावटी राजस्थान में भी, इधर भी कर रहे हैं. और तो वो गिल्ड्स एग्जिस्ट कर रहे हैं तब तक और उनका जो बिजनेस कम्युनिटी है उसके साथ रिलेशन है. कॉलोनियल जब एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर्स आ रहे हैं वो अपने साथ नक्शे भी लेके आ रहे हैं जो कि काइंड ऑफ रिप्रोड्यूस कर रहे हैं वो बाकी जगहों से. घंटा घर फॉर एग्जांपल जो यहाँ पे है वो शायद बहुत अलग नहीं है बाकी जगहों पे जो घंटा घर है. वहां पे एक क्लियर डिस्टिंक्शन पैदा हो रहा है डिवीजन ऑफ लेबर, इंटेलेक्चुअल और मैनुअल लेबर का. वहाँ क्राफ्ट्समैन जो है वो फिगर जो है गिल्ड मास्टर की वो वहां से चली जा रही है मेरे ख्याल से. और ये नया एक एम्प्लॉयमेंट रिलेशन भी पैदा हो रहा है इस नए काइंड ऑफ आर्किटेक्चर के साथ जिसमें एक मजदूर है. और इनफैक्ट इंटरेस्टिंग ये है कि ऊपर क्लॉक बना रहे हो, क्लॉक टाइम इंट्रोड्यूस हो रहा है और नीचे उनकी भी शायद एम्प्लॉयमेंट टाइम के हिसाब से पहली बार डेली वेज या फिर पीस रेट पे, आई डोंट नो, बट आई एम जस्ट थिंकिंग आउट अलाउड कि ये यहाँ पे शायद इस तरीके का कुछ डेवलपमेंट है.
क्योंकि जो क्राफ्ट्समैन हैं उनको सी द थिंग इज द ब्रिटिश they do something very intriguing. I think it's Monroe, I've forgotten who it is in Mayo School. वो क्या करते हैं कि वो क्राफ्ट में they admit only students from घरानास. आर्ट में आगे चल के they are saying we are looking for something new, we are looking for like a completely new conception of art. So art में your घराना doesn't matter, but in craft they are going to admit students who only coming from घराना. So कपूरथला से भी घरानों से लेते हैं students. So the point is that like even if you're saying you're introducing clock time वगैरह, in terms of craft, clock time is not coming in. There you're still going by the idea of gharana, genealogies, etc. Right? So I think like these kinds of granularities will be needed in understanding, the emergence of like this built fabric Jisme some parts are still steeped in the kind of the non kind of anomic time or whatever of the the English working class, and but it's very carefully deployed. Also, it's not as if like it's by design also in terms of the patterns of education that are being introduced. Although the money lenders' relationships with crafts communities is slightly different. I think I don't know if any work has been done on that, and I think therein lies a significant way to understand a huge bulk of the architecture that we see in many small towns. And I don't think anybody's done any work on that. So that's something which might be a way forward.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for staying. And thank you so much, Venu, for knocking so many doors again and again. So,
yeah, it was quite an adventure. You see, I ended up calling Piti also.
I know. I hope now I'm going to hear about that also. That's okay.
So,
नहीं हो गया था मैं हो गया.
No, but we had very diverse discussion.
Passionate about your work, Venu. Even I called her Preeti, so I hope she doesn't answer now.
I'm not going to hear the end of it. She's in England right now, so so it's going to be quite something. Okay.
No, that's
all right. It's okay. I think all for a good cause.
So we hope you come to Abohar sometime for our.
I will. I think
I'm planning a trip to Abohar with my Punjab students, which will be in early April, 2nd of April. So if you can clear it in your mind space, some few days actually, 3-4 days, I can drive you down to Abohar with students. Just think about it. We still time 1.5 months in between, but we are free to come anyway, anytime. So I'm sure fellows will have learned a lot. Love to interact with you more on this particular subject.
Be happy to. Yeah. I'll have to sort of take a look at the schedule as it's emerging. And yeah, I think I also wanted to say that like वो कुछ फिरोजशाह कोटला में walk होने वाला है इस month में.
Right, वो दूसरा है, वो तो हमारे MA के students कुछ करना चाहते हैं आपके साथ. So just figure out a time. There's no hurry. They are in much more enthusiasm, but you figure out your time and then respond accordingly.
Okay.
Thank you, Venu, once again. It was nice having you here.
Thank you so much from all of us.
All the best.
Right.
Sorry about that. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.